What if the terrifying creatures described in legends across the entire world were never myths at all? What if ancient civilizations were all preserving memories of the same forgotten catastrophe? An event so overwhelming that it changed the course of human history forever. Stay with me, because the deeper this mystery goes, the darker Genesis becomes. Buried inside the opening chapters of the Bible is a detail that scholars, archaeologists, and theologians have struggled to explain for generations. It appears in Genesis, echoes through the Book of Enoch, and connects with traditions scattered across nearly every ancient civilization on Earth. Cultures divided by oceans, languages, and thousands of years somehow described the same kind of being with shocking consistency, beautiful female entities tied to the water. Seductive voices that overwhelmed the minds of men. Supernatural creatures remembered with both fascination and fear. The Greeks called them sirens. In West Africa, they were known as Mami Wata. Slavic cultures feared the Rusalki. Ancient Japan wrote of the Ningyo. Babylonian carvings portrayed strange hybrid beings connected to the sea long before modern history ever began recording myths. And the disturbing question is this: why are the details always so similar? Not just similar in appearance, but in behavior, power, and purpose. The same connection to water, the same supernatural beauty, the same deadly influence over men. Genesis 6 hints that something catastrophic happened before Noah's flood. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. The passage then reveals something even stranger. There were giants in the earth in those days. The Book of Enoch expands the story further, describing fallen watchers who descended to earth, corrupted humanity, and unleashed forbidden knowledge upon the world. But one mystery is rarely discussed. If the male Nephilim became the giants of legend, what became of the daughters? Because the flood destroyed the earth above the surface. Yet the depths of the sea remained untouched beneath the waters of judgment. What makes Genesis 6 so unsettling is that it does not read like mythology. It reads like a warning preserved from a world that no longer exists. Before Noah ever built the ark, before the floodwaters covered the earth, Scripture describes an event so strange that many readers pass over it without realizing its significance. Genesis says, "When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Then comes one of the most controversial statements in the entire Bible. There were giants in the earth in those days. The text is brief, but every phrase carries enormous weight. Sons of God, daughters of men, giants, mighty men of renown. Genesis presents them as real beings tied directly to the corruption that existed before the flood. For centuries, scholars argued over the identity of the sons of God. Yet many of the earliest Jewish teachers and early Christian writers reached the same conclusion. They believed these were fallen angelic beings that abandoned their proper place and entered the human world. The New Testament points toward the same idea. Jude 1:6 declares, "The angels which kept not their first estate but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness." That verse describes rebellion, not symbolism. A boundary was crossed. Something entered the world that was never meant to exist within creation. Genesis only gives a glimpse, but the Book of Enoch expands the account in disturbing detail. According to the ancient text, 200 watchers descended upon Mount Hermon and bound themselves together by oath before carrying out their rebellion. They took human wives and produced offspring unlike anything the world had seen before. Those offspring became the Nephilim. The descriptions are unsettling. Massive beings of unnatural strength, violent rulers who spread corruption across the earth. The Book of Enoch describes a civilization collapsing into chaos and disorder. Ancient knowledge was revealed. Forbidden practices spread through humanity. Violence filled the earth so completely that creation itself seemed infected, and Genesis confirms the scale of the collapse with chilling simplicity. "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, not partially corrupted, completely corrupted. By the days of Noah, the world had become something far removed from the order God originally created. But hidden inside this ancient account is a question almost nobody wants to confront directly. The Bible speaks about giants. It describes mighty men, warriors of renown, beings born from the union between the Watchers and human women. The focus always remains on the male offspring, the powerful Nephilim who dominated the earth before the flood. But there is an unsettling silence in the text. If the Watchers produced sons, then daughters were born as well. Genesis barely mentions them. The Book of Enoch moves past them almost entirely. Ancient writers recorded the violence of the male Nephilim, their size, their strength, and the devastation they unleashed across the world. Yet the female descendants remain hidden in the shadows of the narrative, almost as if history itself stopped speaking about them. And that absence may be more disturbing than the details we are actually given. Because the Book of Enoch describes a corruption that spread far beyond humanity alone. The natural order itself began to collapse. Boundaries between created things were being broken. The world before the flood was no longer functioning according to its original design. So think carefully about what that could imply. If the male Nephilim became monstrous rulers and warriors of terrifying power, what became of the daughters born from the same bloodline? Did they simply disappear from history? Or were their stories remembered differently, transformed over centuries into legends whispered by every civilization on Earth? This is where the mystery begins to connect with something much larger. Across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, the same image keeps appearing. Beautiful female beings tied to the water, supernatural voices, seduction, danger. Men drawn toward them with an attraction they cannot explain and cannot resist. The similarities are too precise to ignore, and once that connection appears, Genesis stops looking like an isolated story from the ancient world. It starts looking like the fragmented memory of something humanity was never able to fully forget. As the corruption spread across the earth, the world described in Genesis became almost unrecognizable. Violence filled human civilization. Boundaries established in creation had been broken. According to the ancient texts, humanity was no longer moving toward God. It was descending into chaos. Then came the judgment. Scripture describes a flood unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not a regional catastrophe, not a symbolic disaster. Genesis presents it as a cleansing of the entire earth itself. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Out of all humanity, one man remained set apart. Genesis 6:9 says, Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. That phrase has fascinated scholars for centuries. Some understand it as a description of Noah's righteousness. Others believe it also points to something deeper, a lineage untouched by the corruption spreading through the world before the flood. God commanded Noah to build the ark while the rest of civilization continued blindly toward destruction. Then the fountains of the deep broke open. The heavens released rain upon the earth. Waters covered the world, and everything outside the ark vanished beneath judgment. The giants disappeared. The violent kingdoms disappeared. The corrupted world of the Nephilim was swallowed by the flood. Yet Scripture leaves behind details that make that conclusion far less certain, because the Bible later reveals something deeply unsettling. Centuries after the flood, the spies sent by Moses entered Canaan and returned with a terrifying report recorded in Numbers 13:33. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. Why were giants still appearing after the flood? And the mystery does not end there. Generations later, during the reign of David, another giant emerges from Scripture itself, Goliath of Gath, a warrior so enormous that trained soldiers feared even standing before him. If the flood completely erased the Nephilim, why do echoes of them continue appearing throughout biblical history? The Bible never fully explains it, and beyond Scripture, ancient cultures across the world continued preserving stories of hybrid beings, sea spirits, and supernatural entities long after the flood narrative ended. The names changed, the languages changed, but the core memory remained strangely intact. Either humanity preserved the memory of something real, or traces of that ancient corruption somehow endured beyond the flood itself. Now the mystery moves from scripture into the legends of the ancient world. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Forget the modern image of mermaids created by movies and children's stories. The oldest traditions were never harmless fantasies. These beings were feared. They were associated with seduction, danger, and supernatural influence over the human mind. In Greek mythology, the sirens were not simply creatures of the sea. They were entities whose voices could overpower human will itself. In Homer's Odyssey, sailors were warned that hearing their song meant death. Men who heard them lost all reason and steered their ships directly toward destruction. Odysseus knew the danger before entering their waters. He ordered his crew to seal their ears with wax, while he himself was tied tightly to the mast. Yet even restrained, fully aware of the trap, he still begged to be released when the voices reached him. That detail matters. The power was not physical strength, it was attraction, influence, a supernatural pull that bypassed logic and self-control. And here is something many people never realize. The earliest Greek depictions of sirens did not even resemble modern mermaids. Ancient art portrayed them as hybrid female beings with wings, claws, and unnatural features. Over centuries, the image evolved, but one characteristic never disappeared: the irresistible voice. That same pattern appears again and again across the world. In West African traditions, there is Mami Wata, often described as a beautiful water spirit connected to rivers and oceans. Stories portray her as alluring, mysterious, and capable of drawing men away from ordinary life into another realm entirely. In ancient Mesopotamia, the very region connected to the earliest biblical history, there were accounts of the Apkallu, hybrid beings associated with forbidden wisdom and knowledge from before the flood. The Babylonian figure Oannes emerged from the sea as a part human, part fish being who brought hidden knowledge to humanity. That detail mirrors something deeply important in the Book of Enoch, where the Watchers are said to have revealed forbidden knowledge to mankind. And once that pattern emerges, the same imagery begins appearing across civilization after civilization. The Rusalki of Slavic folklore, the Ningyo of Japan, the Celsates of Scotland and Ireland. Different civilizations, different centuries, different languages, yet the same core description keeps surviving. Female beings tied to the water, supernatural beauty, dangerous attraction, contact with humanity that leads to destruction, transformation, or death. At some point, the similarities stop feeling accidental, because isolated cultures usually create different myths. But these accounts repeat the same themes with disturbing precision, as though fragments of an older memory survived long after the ancient world disappeared beneath the flood. This is where the theory becomes far more unsettling. Genesis and the Book of Enoch both describe a world corrupted before the flood through the union of the Watchers and human women. From those unions came the Nephilim, beings presented as unnatural hybrids of immense power. But according to the Book of Enoch, the corruption did not stop with humanity alone. The text claims the contamination spread into creation itself: animals, birds, reptiles. Even the natural order connected to the waters was described as corrupted. The ancient world before the flood was portrayed as a place where the boundaries of nature had collapsed. Then came the flood. Genesis describes waters covering the earth in total judgment. Everything on land outside the ark perished. Civilization vanished beneath the deep, but that raises a difficult question. If corruption had already spread into the seas, what exactly happened beneath the waters when the flood arrived? The oceans were not destroyed by water, they were expanded by it. And this is the point where some researchers begin connecting the ancient legends back to Genesis. Across the world, stories about supernatural aquatic beings are overwhelmingly feminine. Not giant male warriors like the Nephilim described on land, but beautiful female entities associated with seduction, enchantment, and destruction. Their power is not brute force. It is influence over the human mind and spirit. The pattern is strangely inverted. In Genesis, the Watchers descended because they were drawn toward the daughters of men. But in the legends that survived after the flood, these mysterious female beings are the ones drawing men toward themselves, toward the sea, toward danger, toward places associated with danger and mystery. At that point, the similarities stop feeling random and begin forming a pattern that is difficult to ignore. From the shores of Scotland to the rivers of Africa, from Babylonian carvings to Japanese folklore, the same figure keeps appearing. Female, supernatural, connected to the water, beautiful enough to captivate, dangerous enough to destroy. Some believe these stories are merely symbolic archetypes repeated across human psychology. Others argue they preserve distorted memories of an older reality tied to the world before the flood. Still, an important distinction must be made before going any further. The Bible never directly states that female Nephilim became mermaids or sea spirits. No verse explicitly says this. Scripture does not make that claim. What the biblical text does say is that the corruption before the flood was vast, that the boundaries of creation were violated, and that strange beings existed in the ancient world before divine judgment fell upon the earth. It also says something else that is often overlooked. Genesis 6:12 declares, "For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth." Not some flesh, all flesh. And when that statement is placed beside the flood traditions, the global myths, and the repeated imagery of supernatural beings connected to the sea, an unsettling possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps the legends humanity carried across thousands of years were not created from nothing. Perhaps they were fragments of something humanity was never meant to remember completely, fragments of a world that was never fully forgotten. Before we go deeper, I want you to answer one question in the comments. Do you believe these ancient civilizations invented the same story independently, or were they all remembering something real? Because what comes next may completely change the way you read Genesis forever. What survived after the flood may not have been physical civilizations alone. According to many ancient traditions, memories survived as well, fragments of terrifying realities preserved through myths, symbols, and stories passed from generation to generation. And hidden inside the Bible itself are passages that make this mystery even stranger. In Isaiah 13:21 and Isaiah 34:14, a mysterious Hebrew term appears that translators have debated for centuries: Lilith. Some translations render it as an owl. Others describe it as a night creature. Some leave the word untranslated entirely because of how uncertain its meaning remains. But the ancient Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures used in the ancient world, translates the term with language connected to hybrid or unnatural beings. That translation becomes extremely important once it is placed beside the larger biblical pattern. Isaiah 34:14 describes the aftermath of divine judgment upon Edom, a land left desolate and abandoned. And among the creatures said to dwell there appears this mysterious figure associated in later Jewish tradition with darkness, isolation, seduction, and supernatural danger. The parallels are difficult to miss. Across civilizations, the same archetype appears repeatedly. A feminine supernatural presence tied to ruin, temptation, and places removed from ordinary human life. Not identical stories, but unmistakably similar patterns. Then another detail appears throughout the Old Testament. The Hebrew word tannin is often translated as dragon, serpent, or sea monster. The sea in biblical literature is rarely portrayed as neutral. Again and again, it is connected to chaos, mystery, and forces beyond human control. And nowhere is that imagery more powerful than in Job 41. There, God describes Leviathan in astonishing detail, a creature dwelling within the depth, beyond the reach of human strength. His scales are his pride. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Upon earth there is not his like. The language does not read like simple metaphor. The description is vivid, physical, and overwhelming. Leviathan is portrayed as something humanity cannot dominate, cannot tame, and cannot fully understand. This becomes especially important when connected back to the flood narrative. The judgment of the flood cleansed the earth, but the biblical imagination continued associating the deep waters with mystery and unresolved chaos. Again and again, the sea becomes the setting for dangerous powers, hidden things, and creatures outside the control of mankind. To the ancient world, the deep ocean was not merely geography. It represented a boundary between humanity and forces far older and darker than civilization itself. And the writers of Scripture described those realities with absolute seriousness, not as fantasy, not as folklore, but as part of a world they believed truly existed beyond the edges of human understanding. When all of these pieces are placed together, the picture that emerges is both unsettling and strangely consistent. Genesis describes a time before the flood when the boundaries between the heavenly realm and humanity were broken. The Watchers descended. Human women bore offspring unlike ordinary mankind. Those offspring became the Nephilim, beings connected with power, corruption, and violence on a scale the ancient world could no longer survive. Genesis 6:12 declares, "For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth." The corruption was not partial. According to the biblical account and the traditions surrounding it, the disorder spread through creation itself. And in response, the flood came to erase a world that had moved beyond its original design. But one detail keeps returning like an echo through history. The flood covered the land. Yet throughout the centuries that followed, civilizations scattered across the earth continued preserving stories about mysterious beings connected to the waters. The Greeks spoke of sirens whose voice overwhelmed the human mind. West African traditions describe mamiwata, beautiful spirits tied to rivers and seas. Babylon preserved images of hybrid aquatic beings connected to ancient wisdom. Japan recorded the Ningyo. Northern Europe feared water spirits capable of drawing human beings toward destruction. Different cultures, different continents, different eras, yet the same core image survives: female supernatural beings linked to the sea. Beauty mixed with danger, attraction mixed with fear, creatures capable of influencing human thought, emotion, and behavior. The consistency is difficult to explain away as coincidence alone, especially when these stories appear in societies separated by oceans and thousands of years without direct contact. Most myths evolve differently across civilizations. Yet these accounts preserve the same essential structure again and again, as though fragments of an older memory endured after the collapse of the ancient world. And this is what makes the theory so compelling to some researchers of biblical history. Not because Scripture directly says that female Nephilim became mermaids. It does not. That statement never appears in the Bible. But because the patterns align in ways that are difficult to ignore. The Watchers descended toward humanity before the flood. Ancient legends afterward repeatedly describe supernatural beings drawing humanity back toward the waters. The symmetry is striking. Perhaps mythology preserved more than symbolism. Perhaps beneath the legends, beneath the poetry and folklore passed through generations, there remained distorted memories of a world destroyed long ago, a world humanity never completely forgot. But the mystery does not end in Genesis. It reaches all the way to the final pages of the Bible. One verse in Revelation has puzzled theologians for centuries because of how strangely specific it is. Revelation 21:1 says, "And there was no more sea." That statement appears alongside the greatest promises in Scripture. No more death, no more sorrow, no more pain. A new heaven and a new earth. Yet in the middle of those promises, one detail suddenly appears almost without explanation, and there was no more sea. Why mention the sea at all? For many readers it seems insignificant. But throughout biblical literature, the sea often represents far more than water. It is repeatedly connected with chaos, mystery, and powers beyond human control. In Genesis, darkness moves upon the face of the deep, In the Psalms, the raging waters symbolize forces opposed to divine order. In Job, Leviathan rises from the depths as a creature beyond human power. And in Revelation itself, the beast emerges from the sea. To the ancient biblical mind, the sea was not merely part of nature. It symbolized the unknown abyss, the realm associated with disorder, fear, and things hidden beyond the reach of mankind. Seen through that lens, Revelation 21 takes on an entirely different meaning. If the sea carries that deeper symbolism, then "and there was no more sea" may represent more than geography. It may describe the final removal of every remaining trace of chaos tied to the ancient corruption of the world. The flood judged the earth, but Revelation describes the complete restoration of creation itself. No more abyss. No more chaos hidden beneath the deep. No more fear tied to the unknown. And if the ancient legends carried fragmented memories of that corruption, the sirens of Greece, the Rusalki of Eastern Europe, Mami Wata of Africa, the Ningyo of Japan, the countless water spirits preserved across civilizations, then Revelation presents the moment when every echo of that ancient world is finally brought to an end. A final closing of the door first opened before the flood. The old world began with corruption descending into creation. The final world ends with that corruption removed forever. And there was no more sea for centuries. That single line has unsettled theologians, historians, and readers of scripture alike. There are ancient biblical secrets most people never notice because they are hidden beneath the surface of the text. And the deeper you go, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. The Nephilim remain one of the most mysterious subjects in all of scripture because the deeper the investigation goes, the larger the unanswered questions become. According to Genesis, the flood was not sent merely to punish human wickedness. It came at the collapse of an entire world order, a corruption so widespread that Genesis 6:12 declares, "For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth." The ancient texts describe a reality far removed from the world humanity knows today, a world where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural had been violated, where strange beings walked the earth, and where creation itself had fallen into disorder. Then the flood erased it. But if the world disappeared completely, why did its memories survive? Why do civilizations separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years continue repeating the same disturbing imagery? Again and again the pattern returns. Supernatural female beings connected to the sea, voices capable of overpowering human reason, beauty mixed with danger, attraction leading toward destruction. The details remain astonishingly consistent. The Greeks spoke of sirens, Slavic legends warned of the Rusalki, African traditions preserved stories of Mami Wata, Japan recorded the Ningyo. Cultures that never encountered one another still carried remarkably similar accounts through centuries of human history. That level of consistency forces a difficult question. At what point does mythology stop looking like invention and start looking like memory? Because memories fragment over time. Civilizations collapse, languages change, stories evolve. Yet certain details survive generation after generation, as if humanity is preserving echoes of something older than recorded history itself. And perhaps that is why the biblical references to the deep, the sea, and the ancient world continue to fascinate theologians and historians alike. The Bible presents the flood as the end of one world and the beginning of another. But traces of the first world may have remained buried inside the legends of every civilization that followed, not proof, not certainty, but echoes. Echoes of a forgotten age that humanity could never completely erase from its collective memory.